Ready? Okay. So I want to thank every single one of you for being here tonight. And it's really thrilling to see such a tremendous crowd of folks from the BU community, and I think beyond the BU community. So that's really fantastic. I do want to say, so that we can really be present here tonight for this talk, I want to ask everyone if they've got a cell phone with them to turn it off and put it away. And, you know, I've got mine upstairs in my office, so it's not a problem for me. So cell phones put away. You guys can do that. I want to thank Stanley Stone for creating this incredible lecture series and for making it possible through his generosity and his vision for Cologne to be here tonight and share her story and her vision. Cologne Cahen-Salvador, our guest speaker tonight, is running to be the next Secretary General of the United Nations. Though this job has been held by such historic figures as Dag Hammarskjöld and Kofi Annan, it has never been held by a woman in the 80 years since the United Nations has been created. Along with her partner, Andrea Venzone, who is also here tonight, Cologne co-founded Atlas, a political movement that is global and whose aim is to unite people from around the world to confront the climate crisis, fight economic and political inequality, and promote human rights and democracy. Quite naturally, a fairer, more dynamic, and more transparent UN is part of their agenda. Since 2020, Atlas has been very busy. For example, at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, they campaigned for healthcare workers to have priority access to vaccines as soon as they became available, regardless of their nationality. More recently, Atlas has been creating coalitions of leaders to counter dictatorships, lobbying for boycotts, and organizing protests. For example, Atlas organized a boycott of Russia's presidency of the United Nations Security Council amidst Putin's illegal invasion and war on Ukraine. Along with Amnesty International and the International Criminal Court, Atlas has also been outspoken about the loss of civilian life and the indiscriminate use of lethal force in conflicts from Sudan to Gaza to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. When pointing out violations of human rights, there is often a strong desire to play favorites by diminishing the destructive actions of some governments while highlighting the wrongdoing of others. Atlas does not play favorites. This will inevitably earn them the scorn of various governments around the world, but it should command the respect of anyone who is trying to construct a fair and accurate picture of our global problems in 2025 and to figure out what we should do to protect human rights, foster honest and constructive cooperation across national borders, and address the global and imminent challenge of the climate crisis. As you know, the Paris Agreement, there was a goal to limit heating, global heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level. We've breezed past that, and we're now really heading past 2 degrees Celsius, right? Do the math. If you're used to Fahrenheit, as I am, as an American, take that Celsius figure, multiply it times 1.8 and add 32, and you'll see that that's quite a significant difference in heat. As Dag Hammarskjöld said more than 60 years ago, the UN was created not to take us to heaven, but to save us from hell. Apologies, Cologne, if you were going to use that quote in your talk. It's like one of the most famous quotes about the UN because it is one of the best, right? So it was not created. It's not a utopian institution to take us to heaven. It is a practical, cooperative institution to save us from destroying ourselves and the biosphere on which we depend. When Dag Hammarskjöld made that remark, he was thinking about nuclear weapons. But now the growing disruption of our climate through unchecked greenhouse gas emissions and rampant deforestation has proven to be another challenge for which the cooperative framework of the United Nations has become essential. Cologne believes, as I do, that the UN must change, indeed transform itself to meet the existential threat which the climate crisis will pose to every society on Earth in this century. And now, it is my pleasure and my honor to pass the microphone to Cahen-Salvador. Come on up, Cahen. Give her a big hand.
Yeah. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today and listening to me talk about the United Nations. I know it's an almost impossible thing to feel excited about, so I promise that I'm going to try to make it exciting, simple, political, and hopefully that you'll leave feeling like this is about you and that you should have power to change it. So thank you for taking the leap of faith. Honestly, 10 years ago, I don't know if I would have come to this talk about the United Nations and how to change it. I really appreciate you spending an hour of your time with me. So let's talk about it. The name of this lecture is Transforming the United Nations to Confront the Climate Crisis. It sounds very grand, very big, the type of things you read on the front page of a book, of a 5-star hotel hosting a conference. But that's not what the United Nations is about. Not whatsoever. Throughout the next hour, I want to show you that the United Nations is actually about you. It's not something grand and distant. It's something that will impact your life. Whether you want it or not, it's completely irrelevant, to be honest. It will shape it, it will impact it, and it will determine whether you live a healthy future or one where the world burns in hell. That's basically it. So in turn, the question is whether you want to shape it, whether you want to impact it, whether you want to get power in order to ensure that the United Nations leaves you a world that is worth living in, that you can be proud of, whether the great powers of this world want it or not. So you've heard my professional bio that sounds much better than it is, to be honest, from Sam. Let me just tell you about my personal one, because as I just told you, the United Nations is something that is deeply personal or should be deeply personal to all of us. It's something, again, that will impact you and your life. So all of this sounds great. Most of it was by luck when it worked out, but it's not actually really what I'm completely doing. This summer I was at my best friend's wedding, and this is how he introduced me, and this is what he had to say about me before I gave a horrible speech. Colomb is the weirdest person I know. That's it. That was the whole introduction. And I am weird, and what I'm going to be speaking about is pretty weird, for a lot of reasons that you'll see. But he didn't say that because of one of the things that your professor mentioned, right? Like, I did European politics, I built European political parties, very progressive, with the idea of countering national extremists. And I'm not doing the same across the world. I think we need to come together, I think we need to work together across borders to deal with the biggest challenges of our time. He said this because, indeed, I'm running for United Nations Secretary General. That's basically the UN chief. And that's weird on so many levels. One, because this person is selected by 5 countries behind closed doors. 2, because countries have no intention of actually letting that person lead the United Nations and do a lot of things. That's why they don't have competences. And 3, as you can see, I'm really the perfect picture of someone who would become United Nations Secretary General. All of them have been manned for 8 years. The youngest one, when they enter office, I think the average age was 58 years old. I'm still a tiny bit younger than this. They were all former heads of states and diplomats, very far from my background of organizing protests worldwide. And most of them recently have been not so outspoken or completely silent on a lot of massive human rights violations, war crimes, crimes against humanity, the list goes on, when it concerns a few superpowers that they can't upset because they were chosen by them. Again, not exactly the typical person they would be willing to consider for this role in the first place. I have to pull up my note because 40 minutes is a long time. I'm nevertheless running to fix this broken and undemocratic system. And I really think it is broken and undemocratic. I'm going to tell you why I think it's great, why I think we need to fix it, but it is broken. Because I think that if we mobilize enough people, if we shake it up enough, if we upset them enough, they will be left with no choice but to actually try to change the United Nations, to fix those broken systems, to enable people like you to take power, to decide in which direction it's going, to decide whether it's going to act on things like climate that we're going to be talking about today. Okay, let me show you. Please bear with me. I already said I'm weird, so this is going to be weird and awkward, and it's okay. Can you all close your eyes for 2 minutes? Just do it. I know it's weird. Okay, let's imagine that we're in 2035. Most of the students will have a job. I see you, close your eyes. Most of the students will have a job. Some of the faculties probably will still have a job, hopefully. Now, stop thinking about yourself. What is the world that you want to see in 10 years, 2035? And don't think about the current limitations and how messed up the planet is and how messed up politics is, especially right now. Just in 2035, you have a magic wand. You can create any type of universe you want. What do you actually see? What is the first image that comes to your mind? Is it a healthy planet? One where, I'm trying to make this positive, one where you live in adequation with nature? Is it one where you have no wars because we understood that collaboration is greater than confrontation or destruction? What is the image that actually comes to mind? Open your eyes if you aren't already asleep. Anyone? Anything that came to mind? I actually need you, I know it's awkward, just tell me anything that came to mind. You can shout it. You came with me, you can't speak. Anything that came to mind?
A greener planet.
A greener planet? Anything else?
Less people suffer from hunger.
Less people suffering from hunger. Less resource exploitation. Keep it coming. Anything else?
No wars.
Sorry, I can't hear you. No wars.
Less corruption.
Less corruption.
More biodiversity.
Okay, we can keep on going. All of this is amazing. And it sounds, by the way, I love it because you went full dream. It sounds like the answers of a beauty pageant. You know, we want peace and a healthy planet, and it's exactly what I was looking for. And I'm going to make a wild guess. 90 to 100% of those topics are global in nature. What it means is no country alone can stop it, right? We heard about less corruption. We heard about no hunger. No hunger is a global issue. We have enough money, enough resources for no one to die of hunger. Yet, 1 out of 10 human beings today lives in extreme poverty. We heard about a greener planet. We're going to talk about this and how depressing it is and how to change it. This is also a global topic, right? 90 to 100% of the topics, I'm sure people thought about some pretty personal and, national topics as well, but a lot of those topics by nature are global. And this is important to remember, because when we talk about, so let's go back to climate, right? This lecture is about climate, but what we're going to talk about today could apply to pandemics, to poverty, and to good governance, to democracy, to human rights, to AI. I can go on and on and on. When we talk about those topics, a lot of nationalistic politicians, to say it politely, would like you, or the setting message is, we're going to close down, this is going to be great, by closing down borders, we're going to avoid problems, etc. And their only resource when speaking about climate is, it's a hoax. Because it is clear that if it's a global issue, but suddenly you're trying to close down and pretend that you can deal with it on your own, not the best outcome. So they have to negate the existence of the problem in order to be able to make it national. Because those problems go beyond borders, so we need to be able to deal with them beyond borders. Before we dive into it, sorry, I'm jet lagged and my English is not my first language. Before we dive into it, let's get on the same page about climate. I assume most of you know what it is, what is being caused. The professor already mentioned some of the elements, but I'm going to read the scientific definitions. Humans caused it, not the scientific part, that's my summary of a long Wikipedia page. Humans caused climate change. It mainly occurred by burning fossil fuels in homes, factories, and transports, right? What it does, when we burn fossil fuels, it releases greenhouse emissions, get that trapped, and it warms up the planet. The key numbers that you were talking about, and I actually also translated them to Fahrenheit, is we are supposed to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this is 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, right? 1.5. That's 1.5 before we started collectively really messing up the planet and burning fossil fuels like if there were no tomorrow before the industrial age. Simple enough? Yeah, we messed up. We are now way above 1.5 already. According to current predictions, by 2100, we'll get to 3 degrees Fahrenheit on the current scenarios. That is 3 degrees Celsius, sorry, 5.4 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100. Just to put it into perspective, that's 600 million people more that are impacted by the risk of floods. Food production is halved across the planet. Just imagine this for a second. Devastating habitat loss, right? That's what we're on course for. So unless you plan to live on Mars and watch the world burn down like in a horror movie, and as some pretty messed up individual that think that this is a great thing, this will impact you, your life, if you want kids, your kids, and any future generation. And this is wherever you stand, wherever you live in the world, whether you live here, you are from here, or in another country. This will impact you. And this also proves the value of global cooperation, because all of those that are the most impacted already by global challenges, whether they be people that live in Tuvalu, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing the name, but it's a tiny island nation that has 11,000 inhabitants and is already being devastated by the rising sea levels, or here as well, right? It impacts the coastlines of Boston. This will impact the entire world. Differently, while the roots of climate are global, the causes at the local level are felt very differently. The most vulnerable are much more impacted. It will still impact us all, every single one of us. Some of you in this room might have experienced it recently, and if so, I'm very, very sorry for it. The recent LA wildfires, right? It killed over 29 people, displaced 100,000, will cause insane numbers to repair the damages, to rebuild, etc. Those recent wildfires were impacted very locally communities. But they were not caused locally. They cannot be fought only locally. Local responses can be better, we can rebuild better, we can adapt, we can mitigate, we can do our parts. But it is not a local issue. If you think about it, those wildfires were made 35% more likely by climate change. 35%, it's huge. It's 1/3 more likely. Because climate change induced factors like reduced rainfalls, warmer temperatures, and a drier atmosphere prime the conditions for them to spread. And if we stay on course for the 3 degrees I mentioned before, again, apologies, I don't remember what this is actually in Fahrenheit, it will get much worse. Compared to pre-industrial level, it will get 80% more likely. That is enormous. That is the difference between destruction and complete obliteration of a city, of a region. It is absolutely insane if we don't change course. So even if California was on track to meet its climate objective, which it's not, clearly it wouldn't be enough. It's important for it to meet its climate objective, but it wouldn't be enough. Even if this country was on track, which now is definitely not, it wouldn't be enough. So all of this is, it will get more positive, by the way, but all of this depressing thinking is to show you that while impacts of global challenges like climate are local, are felt in your communities, are felt differently, will impact you personally differently, they cannot be solved at the local level only. You absolutely need global collaboration to stop the worst from happening. So the question is, how do we get there? How do we create this global cooperation? How do we save the world? And that's not when something like Captain America comes in. This is where the United Nations come in. And this is when I'm saying I'm actually going to try to make you excited about it because it will impact your future. And your chances are not seeing an 80% risk of things like the LA wildfires happening in the future. Okay, let's go back to the Paris Agreement. Does anyone know what the Paris Agreement is? It was mentioned briefly in the intro, but does anyone know what it is?
It's a limitation on certain pollutive activities with the hope of reducing global warming to below 1.5.
Yes. Anyone else? Any other elements? I'm mentioning the Paris Agreement because the United Nations, and we're going to speak about how messed up it is and how it's failing on many, many topics, but can actually save us from hell. And it was mentioned. I think it should do much more than save us from hell, that's an opinion, but it can actually save us from hell. It was the case with the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is indeed theoretically a legally binding treaty that was made in, shocker, Paris in 2015, from one thing that is called the Climate Conference of Parties, COPs. It was COP21. It was a couple of years back with the idea of 196 parties, which is huge, 196, agreeing to stay below the 2 degrees Celsius threshold, and ideally under the 1.5, because we knew that after 1.5, things would get catastrophic. It was huge. Imagine again, like I know it's taken for granted now, but look at the world we live in, right? And imagine the great powers of this world agreeing that together they will stop destroying our planet, limit their emissions, will have to submit their commitments, have a public review of their commitments, fund other countries to transition, and do so in a transparent manner. It's enormous, it's amazing. They actually managed to do this in 2015, and it looked like it was going to go great, right? It looked like things were going to work out. We're going to be able to limit emissions, we're going to survive, all of this was going to be good. Anyone knows what happened on the first day of Trump being back in office, and linked to climate, right? Not in general. He pulled the US out of the Paris Agreement. And while we're going to talk more about what this actually means for the United Nations, this for me shows a lot of its problems. Besides the fact that very few countries, if not none, actually met their own commitments, the commitments they chose to make themselves. Under the Paris Agreement, one country was able to unilaterally withdraw from the Paris Agreement, putting it and our collective future at great risk. One country alone, one day. And this shows a wide range of issues. The UN never had the enforcement capacity to actually implement the Paris Agreement. 196 countries came together and said, yeah, great, let's do it. And that's amazing that they agreed to do it. Oftentimes, you need a bit more than willingness and goodwill, right? That's why your government, my government, has enforcement mechanisms, punishments, a carrot and a stick, and all of this, right? It's so that it can actually implement those measures, and it didn't. And then one country alone gets to backtrack. One country that is also, by the way, responsible for a huge part of emissions, a huge part of the world's emission in the first place, 14% of global greenhouse emissions. And when he came back to office and unilaterally withdrew, he signaled a push for fossil fuels, drilling, and the obliteration of environmental protection. As he said, drill baby drill, or kill baby kill our future, right? That's what one person, one day, from one country managed to do for all of us. So again, the COPs was supposed to be this really great moment, this moment where the world came together and were able to take decisive action. And this matters. But because of the structure of the UN, it has little consequences. It's up to our goodwill, to our willingness as citizens to hold it accountable, to organizations that are protesting, to governments that are leading the way and showing the impact, but it's up to us. It's not able to actually enforce it. I could make it much worse. A lot of petrostates have been hosting COPs in the last few years, using it as a place to make backroom deals about fossil fuel exploitation. Could make it even much worse with the fact that you have more lobbyists, and that's oil and gas lobbyists, than a lot of government delegations from smaller countries at COPs, etc., just to show you the type of place it is in the first place. And this is very problematic, because if global cooperation hinges on a few countries being willing to do what's right, but depends on all on having an absolute consensus of countries sticking to it, it's difficult to be very, very hopeful about the future. By the way, again, it will get positive. I'm actually a very optimistic person, and I think we're going to make it out of all of those crises I just want to mention. So, some might say, who am I to judge the moral compass of a president? I'm not American, you can hear it from my French accent. I don't live here, I don't vote for him. But as I said, it impacts me. And more than this, many smarter people than myself have actually called on the United Nations to do more, to have more power, to be more like, for example, a world government. It's the case of Einstein. Einstein said, I can read you the quote, "Mankind's desire for peace can be realized only by the creation of a global government." So I don't really agree with the mankind thing. Humankind will be better. But apart from semantics, it shows that we actually need a power, a global power that represents us, where we have a say, that has our trust, legitimacy, competencies, money to be able to lead us forward. And if you think about it, and this is when I'm going to try to make you excited about the UN after all of this depressing thing, the UN is actually the wildest dream we've ever had. And I really believe it. I know it sounds like this really far-fetched thing with robot-like humans in gray suits that push papers around and so on, but it's not. It's our wildest dream. After the Second World War, not even 1 year after the loss of lives of millions of people, we decided to come together and actually agreed to collaborate systematically to maintain peace and security. We said no more. This is huge. It was after the worst world war we've seen. We managed to say this will not happen again. We will come together, we will collaborate, we will use courts, we will use diplomacy, this miracle that's standing that's called international law. And we will use that to ensure that this never happens again. Again, we've seen that it has failed a lot at preventing wars, that the never again is hypocritically applied. But still, we managed to do this. And this gives me a lot of hope that after some of the worst crimes ever committed, we managed to come together. It's a place where we can resolve our conflicts. After people lost everything again, their family members, their possessions, their homes had to move, they agreed that they would come and they would build an institution to represent them. This is insane. I want to tell you, and I'm sorry about this part, but it will be useful, about the UN and what it actually does in 5 minutes. And I promise I'll keep it to 5 minutes. Because while it's the wildest dream, it's also an incredibly complex organization, and it would have been better with a slide, but you would have fallen asleep in 1 second, so I decided to do it in another way. It's an insanely complex organization of over 130,000 people, with, I think it's 30 affiliated organizations, funds, projects that are supposed to implement a lot of different programs. And I'm going to simplify it, oversimplify it, actually, so please fact check me and inform yourself on top of it, because I'm going to tell you my version of it. I'm going to tell you about 3 bodies that you should remember. The first one is the United Nations General Assembly. The General Assembly is the place where all countries come together, one country, one vote. They come together, they debate, and they vote on all things linked to what the UN is supposed to do, so international affairs. Does it remind you of any body or institute in the US system, in the US government? One country, one vote, you vote democratically on resolutions. The US Senate. It's the equivalent, right? So the idea, again, I'm going to take Tuvalu, 11,000 inhabitants, has 1 vote. India, 1.4 billion people, 1 vote. They come together. Only thing is, they don't really have binding powers, unlike the Senate. But they come together and vote. That's the first one to remember. The second one to remember is the Secretariat. The Secretariat is the one that is in charge of the day-to-day stuff, right? Budget, overseeing peacekeeping operations, creating the agenda of what is going to be discussed at the General Assembly, and executing what they say. Does it remind you of anything in the US system? Anything? The executive. It's the executive branch. The executive branch with what I think is close to 0 power, because everything that matters has to be approved by the third body, which is the Security Council. And again, I'm giving you my version of the UN, right? You won't find it this way on the website. The Security Council, and I can't find an equivalent, I spent a lot of time trying in the US system because of its original sin. And I'll get to this in just 1 second. But the Security Council is the most powerful body. It's the one in charge of peace and security. Sounds great, right? It's the one that is able to impose sanctions. And it's the one that is able to order peacekeeping operations. It's the one that is able to authorize military interventions. It's the one which has power and binding competences. And here's where the makeup actually matters. The UN Security Council is 10 members that are rotating. For the sake of this conversation and simplicity, I won't talk to them or about them. And 5 permanent members. 5 members, and this is the original sin for me of the United Nations. 5 members that have a veto power over anything substantive, meaning anything that matters, anything that is non-procedural. Do you know who those 5 members are? Exactly, or the so-called winners of the Second World War. So US, UK, France, China, and Russia have a veto power. This makes them first-class countries. They get to veto anything that they want. Again, the the General Assembly can still pass resolutions, non-binding. They get to veto. And the rest of the world, 188 other countries, for me, are second-class countries. They get to talk, vote on resolutions that are non-binding, and then listen to what 5 countries decide is worth considering or not. Whether 5 superpowers agree to put aside their own national interests in order to consider humanity's greater interest. To give you ideas of when the veto is used, Russia has systematically used it on Ukraine, on any discussion of Ukraine, including on discussing Ukraine. The US has systematically used it on any discussion linked to Israel, any measures linked to Israel. I'm just using this two, I could go on and on. My country is just as bad and as responsible, right, France? So those are the 3 bodies I want to tell you about. I'll ignore all of the rest, courts, and a lot of other complicated things because we would stay here for a week and it's not the purpose of this. But just remember, right? The UN is supposed to maintain a peace and security. It evolved a bit, now it's also supposed to ensure we live on a healthy planet with dignity, inequality. It has no competences almost to do so. And it still has to subject itself to 5 superpowers. And whether in today's world, in today's hyper-polarized world, the likes of Russia and the United States on different sides can agree that something is important enough that they should not be using the veto in the first place. It's not going so well, right? It's not like we have a very peaceful and secured world at this stage. Sorry, my phone completely crashed, I need to reopen. So, we clearly need to stop that madness. We clearly need to address the situation. But before, I want to draw your attention to something that I mentioned earlier, something that got lost in translation through decades of geopolitical games, what they consider to be games. I mentioned it earlier, but the United Nations is not something distant. It's not something that is basically, again, robots, gray-suited individuals pushing papers. That's not, it is, that's also what it is. But it's not the only thing the United Nations is. The United Nations is blood and sweat. What the UN is to me is it's peacekeepers going into other places whose language they don't speak, culture they don't get, to protect people they've never met because they think that they deserve more. It's scientists that will try to find the next vaccine so that the next pandemic doesn't kill more people and that people have access to it. It's scientists that try to find solutions to the climate crisis so that we stand a chance. The United Nations is people that are putting their lives at risk every single day and are getting killed right now in conflict situations because they think that someone who lives on the other side of the world matters just as much as their own family, because they think that we deserve to work together and collaborate. That, for me, is what it is, on top of the gray-suited robot-like people that push papers around and the insane bureaucracy, and on top of all of the issues. And that's why I think it's worth trying to rebuild it, not only so that we can actually survive and stand a chance against the climate crisis, but so that we can actually do better, stand together, collaborate, instead of destroying one another. The UN is a matter of life and death. The UN saves lives every single day. It does so. It almost eradicated polio. We don't have weapons in space, thanks to the United Nations. It diminished our nuclear arsenal, chemical weapons. I think it's like 98% of all declared chemical weapons have been eradicated thanks to the United Nations. It's huge. It had huge successes. It saves us from hell, as it was said. Not always, but sometimes, when it's convenient. So I'm not going to pretend that the UN is the only solution, far from it, right? Who knows, maybe one day a tech billionaire finds an incredible scientific advance that saves us all and saves the climate crisis and we don't have to diminish emissions. I wouldn't bet on it, but why not? There's a lot of maybes. Maybe we have an enlightened leader who leads the way in an incredible direction and no countries magically follow. Why not, right? There's a lot of maybes. I wouldn't though put all of my eggs in one basket. I don't think that's how the world is necessarily going. And I don't want to see so much destruction until finally some enlightened leaders come to be on this planet and decide that we are worth saving. So what can we actually do? Now that you are all climate experts, basically, now that you are all UN experts, you basically have a PhD in UN at this stage, what can we actually do to ensure that we stand a chance, to rebuild it, to stop those wrongs. So again, let's go back to what we said at the beginning. Trump withdrew day one from the Paris Agreement, right? That's bad. We agree on that? That's a bad thing? Okay, it could get much, much worse. And that's the last depressing thing I will say about this. Sounds bad, it could get much, much worse. That's because by doing so, he enabled other countries to potentially follow suit. He legitimized it. By doing so, he's undoing decades of climate progress. So what can we do? I'm not a fortune teller, but I see two paths ahead. And I can already tell you that the first one kind of sucks, and I really prefer the second one. The first one is we continue like we're doing. We say, okay, that's bad, whatever. I'll go and watch Love is Blind after or something like this, and give up. We say, okay, it's bad. If he does it, why do I really care? Do I actually need to continue to implement my climate pledges as a country? Maybe not. Maybe I keep on drilling. So the world keeps on going this way, or worse, right? Because by doing so, he delivered a triple punch, a financial one. The US is a quarter of the UN's budget, a political one. He enabled other countries to do the same, and a moral one. He set horrible standards. That's solution one. We continue this way, one day we will die potentially of the climate crisis or another crisis. Some people suffer more than others, pretty grim. As I said, I don't really love this part, and it's, from now on, it will only be positive if you hang on with me for another 10 minutes. And that's the path that I wouldn't choose, but that's the path we are on track to having unless we do something. So then there's the second path. It's much harder. It's much more strenuous. It's what I think historical moments are made of. It's what I think in 100 years we will look back on and say, incredible, you know, a kind of like Mandela-like moment. Those people got it. They decided to act. They said enough. They decided that from now on they were going to do better. And this is the moment, basically, where countries and the world come together and understand that this situation has to stop. And so they do two main things, short-term and long-term, for this difficult road ahead. The short-term one is they say, okay, it's extremely unfair. The United States, and again, I'm just speaking on the US because we are here in the US. As I said, my country is just as bad on a lot of those issues, and a lot of other countries are doing on climate and related topics horrible crimes, right? But let's keep on going on the US just because we're here and Trump was just elected. So the US withdrawing leaves a huge funding gap. So countries say, okay, look, not fair. We are going to fill this funding gap. Clearly, fighting the climate crisis means actually putting money where your mouth is. It means we need to adapt to the new realities, right? Climate is happening. We need to adapt to protect communities. We need to mitigate it. So we need to stop emitting. We need to invest into new technologies. We need to invest into alternative ways of living. It means funding losses and damages for communities that have already been impacted. And so they say, okay, we're actually going to do what we're supposed to do a long time ago and meet our climate objective, but we're going to take on more because the realities have changed since 2015. Now the realities are, the world is more polarized, some people think climate is not a real thing, and we need to take on more to ensure that it doesn't get worse. That's with money. And then politically, they say, okay, we are here, we clearly need to avoid the worst from happening. So we are going to look at the science because we already have most of the solutions to the climate crisis. It's easy to think and to be overwhelmed by it, right? We're heading towards 3 degrees, it's horrible, we're all gonna die, etc. But no, we have the solutions. We know how to stop this from happening. It's pretty clear. I'm gonna give you a few, but there are countless others. And countries say, okay, we are going to implement it right now, right here, regardless of whether some countries are deciding to get out and not do their part. We will do it because it is our collective responsibility. This includes, for example, passing a fossil fuel treaty. What this means is, again, fossil fuels destroying the planet, heating it up, we're going to die. Remember this part? We should probably stop new exploitation from happening. We should transition towards cleaner energies. We should move from paying fossil fuel subsidies to green subsidies. There's a lot of science on this, and I'll take your question just after. Second, carbon tax. I'm just giving you, for example, economists agree that a carbon tax is actually one of the best economic tools we have in order to mitigate and stop polluting. I think it's like a quarter of the world is currently covered by it only. We're going to pass it. We're going to make it happen. Another one, as I said, we need money. Money is a big one. At the last COP, it was supposed to be a finance COP. We're supposed to be able to fill the banks in order to support communities already impacted, to mitigate, to adapt. We are going to create a real fund in order to ensure that poorer countries, poorer communities that are already impacted will be able to adapt, mitigate, and pay for loss and damages. Last one I'm going to give you. One of the things we do is destroy nature, right? We destroy it, we destroy, we destroy. We're going to create safe zones, restoration zones, conservation zones, in order to ensure that our common heritage, our planet, can survive, get restored, and get better. I'm just giving you 4 examples. There are many more. We can discuss them after. There's a lot of science on what can and should be done in order to get the climate crisis under control, to stop the worst from happening. So that's short term. We get money, and we actually start implementing the measures that scientists have told us for decades we need to implement. So to say that's the easy part. We then go to the second part of the strenuous road to tackling the climate crisis, and as I said, this is not actually only about climate, it's about a lot of other issues, and to ensuring that we can tackle all of those topics systematically. And that's when I go back to the United Nations. As I said, the UN for me is fundamentally needed to be able to tackle some of the biggest challenges the world faces. Climate is the perfect example. How else are we going to be able to do it? We can't continue to hope that one country does right because it's right. We can't continue to hope that suddenly oil and gas companies are going to get that, being driven only by profit is not the best thing, and are going to become our guardian angels. That's not going to happen. We need a global forum to be able to together collaborate and move forward. The thing is, this global forum kind of sucks right now. It's very messed up. I gave you some of the examples. The list could go on, right? So we need a United Nations that actually functions, that actually represents us, that has our trust. The trust in the UN is declining every single year. That has the legitimacy to act. If you have first-class and second-class countries, not a great thing to have legitimacy. That has the competences, that has the money to be able to implement all of this. And so this is when UN reform comes in. And this is when, although it sounds very unsexy, it's actually fundamentally needed. We need, number one, to give it the trust. The UN needs our trust. How do you give it trust? You give your government trust by voting for it, by being able to run for office, by being able to do all of this, right? That's how you give government, there's a lot of other mechanisms, I'm simplifying it. That's how a part of it is giving it trust. So you need to reform the United Nations in order, for example, to be able to run for Secretary General, which is what I'm doing, to vote for them. You could have a parliamentary assembly that acts as, going back to the US metaphor, the Congress, the counterpart to the Senate, right? To the General Assembly. A parliamentary one where we elect our representatives that are able to make decisions to represent us, the people. You give it back its trust. Second, you need to give the United Nations money. Again, the UN is funded less than the city of New York, just to put it into perspective. I can actually give you the number. I think the annual operating budget of the United Nations, I'm going to say something wrong unless I see it, is probably $75 billion a year. The city of New York, I'm getting to it, is above $104 billion a year. Again, New York is a great city, really important, big, right? United Nations. Doesn't really add up. How are you supposed to stop wars, climate, pandemics, distribute food, help refugees, etc., with that little money? That includes peacekeeping operations. It's nothing. We need to get the UN the money it needs. And it can't be up to member states like now to maybe potentially pay up if they feel like it at one point. So you need to have a tax authority. You need to be able to levy taxes. How else do you fund something? You need to have the power to get it yourself. Again, that's where the more revolutionary thing that the UN doesn't like to hear comes in. So democracy, money. And the last thing I want to mention is you want to give it power. And that is often scary and sounds like the type of Star Wars dystopian world type of thing. Every time I say like the UN should have more power, people go like, no, please, it's going to be terrible. This is really going to go wrong. And I get the fear. But you give a certain type of competencies to your states, right? You agree that certain issues are federal and not a state issue, that your federal government should be able to do it. I'm French, we do the same in the European Union. We accept that the European Union should deal with regional topics, that there are some that should be at a greater level than the states, because it concerns us all. Climate is a global issue. We should work on it together. I'm impacted by your country's decisions. You are impacted by mine. How do you not have a say in this? So it needs to have the competencies to be able to implement decisions. Binding powers. It absolutely needs to have this. So I'm almost done, just to recap. What we talked about so far is climate is going to kill us all unless we do something about it. It's global. We need a global organization or institution to do something about it. Right now we have the UN, very far from perfect. It's the only one with such a huge membership, kind of buy-in necessary, and the willingness to tackle those topics. Problem is, very, very messed up. Doesn't really work on a lot of topics. It's failing to ensure peace and security. The world is going down in flame, etc. What can we do about it? Two things. If we take the good road, not the bad road. I'm assuming we all agree we can't just let the world go and burn in flames. The first thing is, take action. So we fund the climate transition and we implement the political actions we're supposed to implement decades ago. And the second one is, we reform the United Nations to give it the trust, legitimacy, power, money, and competencies needed to do its job in the first place. Give me 2 more minutes and I'll take your question. But the thing is, I know it's very easy to say that, right? I know it's easy to sell a big vision and to say, the United Nations should be doing better. We should be implementing our decisions. And if anyone listened to it, it would be great. The question is, how do we make this happen? How can we actually change this when the United Nations loves, and a lot of power love to make us feel like it's very distant and it doesn't concern us. It doesn't concern you. You don't have a say. You already elect your government. They decide that. Again, this is about you, right? It feels distant, but it's not. This is your future. You like it or not, same thing. It's your future that is being discussed every single day. And people are making decisions about it without you. This is extremely messed up in the first place. So this is when you actually have the power to change things. I'm going to give you a couple of ideas. There's a lot more we can discuss after. One, you decide to go and work for the UN and do great from the inside. Maybe it's possible. You decide to become head of your country and you lead the world to enlightenment. That would be great. That's one way. Second, you make an enormous amount of money and decide that you're going to, bend institutions to your will through money. Not my favorite option. Kind of a dystopian world we're living through right now. Not the one I would like to see, but that's another way. Last one, you join protest movements, organizations, and political parties that are trying to disrupt it and take action. Again, my movement, Atlas, is doing it. It's one of the many, many, many that are doing it. You build your own. You're very unhappy with what exists. You decide to build your own organization. The sky is literally the limit. As I said, I'm doing something very, very weird. I'm running for a position that I'm unqualified for, way too radical for, no one wants me to do. No country is willing to see me make it happen. But because I think that this way I can disrupt the status quo and I can push them to change their processes. Get weird. Literally, the sky is the limit, right? History was not made in a very simple manner. We love to look back at history and think that it was easy. Mandela went to prison. This means a lot of people got on the street and apartheid was done, right? Greta magically appeared and there were a lot of protests. And women got the right to vote like this. It just happened. No, it was decades of struggle. It was decades of inner fights, of losses, of people dying, ending up in prison. It was decades of setbacks. It was decades of people trying really different things, hitting at one another for not doing what they thought was the right thing. And then somehow, at one point, things change. Because what it is, a common playbook to make you feel very distant, to make you feel like you don't have a say. When something is wrong, it becomes right at one point. I know it sounds very cheesy, but it is true. When enough people rise up, when enough people believe that what is happening is unfair and unacceptable, things change. It does. You don't know how exactly it will happen, and in hindsight, we'll look about it and write a history book and make it very simple and clear and say that this event was the moment. You don't know. What you know is that if you don't do anything about it, we go on the first path, the destructive one, the doomsday one. If you decide to act, it becomes the second path. So let me close with this. I think that the UN is a dream worth fighting for. I think that it's messed up. I think it's unfair. I think it's undemocratic. I think it's corrupt sometimes. I think we don't have a say. I think that unless we change it, it will get much worse. Now, I imagine a world very much like the one you mentioned, right? Greener, less corruption, less exploitation of resources, less wars. I would add a lot of others, right? Because this, again, is about climate and how to fix it, but it's not really. It's about much more. It's about how do we ensure that 1 in 10 human beings don't die of hunger in a world of plenty? How do we ensure that the next pandemic, more people don't die because we refuse to share IP rights, vaccines, and knowledge? How do we ensure that we don't have flows of weapons heading to Russia, Israel, Sudan against its whole population, and so on and so forth, because we didn't think that collaboration was worth it, and we decided to be hypocritical. For me, that's what the UN is about. It's about a dream of the future. So whichever way you think is the way forward, you can disagree with me. You can say, look, the United States is going to save us all. Fine. Don't believe it, but fine. But whichever way is the way forward, you need to take action. That's my call to you, and that's it. I'm very happy to take all of your questions. I saw your hand, by the way, before.
Yeah, my question was, in your country of France, more than 65% of the energy is nuclear energy. What would you think about implementing more nuclear energy in the US? And also,
Is it working?
Hello? Yeah, my question was, in the speaker's country of France, more than 65% of their energy is nuclear energy. And I was wondering what you thought about increasing the nuclear energy in the United States. I also had a question that in most first world countries in the world, especially France, there's a huge infrastructure of high-speed rail and train systems, and that's extremely lackluster in the US. How come there's not more of a global push from the UN about building high-speed rail in the US? Thank you.
All right. Very easy. I can keep this one so I can.
Okay,
Thank you so much. Very easy questions. So nuclear in 2 seconds, and I'm not a scientist nor a climate expert, disclaimer. Number one, if we had better tech that were cleaner with less risk, I would be all for not having nuclear considering the risk. It doesn't seem like we have a lot of other solutions. France is doing it not in a great way. It doesn't have all of the safety measures and so on. I don't think it's terrible right now to use nuclear unless we have better options to transition out. That's my take. Your second point on the UN doing more on trains. So that's a general issue, right? The UN has panels of scientists, entire departments of scientists that are saying exactly how to get out of the climate crisis. Reducing aviation is one of them, right? A lot of stuff. I talked about the political branch that is wrong. The UN is the refugee agency that creates refugee camps and supports people in the situation. It distributes food through the World Food Program, helps with education through UNICEF. It's an enormous amount of organization. Again, it's more than 30 affiliated organization programs, etc., that do direct services. And when you receive those direct services, normally you get it more, right? You get what's wrong, but you also see the benefits of it. So on the trust, often on services and so on, it is there from low to middle income countries. The problem is, countries see, especially right now with the political climate and divisions, that the UN doesn't represent them fully. And that's when you see more and more anger. So I used to do a lot of town hall meetings with our volunteers. And I did one 3 years ago in Nairobi when we discussed how to reform the UN and came up with solutions. And people were super constructive. Especially Nairobi has a big UN agency. I did one last year. The same people were screaming, burn the UN down. There was a complete shift within the 2-year mark. And that's because when you see the UN's reaction and countries' reaction to different wars, you are delusioned. You see that suddenly some countries matter more than others. You see that the veto power will be used to protect your own self-interest and your allies. And this is when people lose trust. So how to rebuild it? Remove the veto and actually enable countries to have an equal say. If this is not going to happen, at least give more countries from different continents a veto rights ad interim so that there is representation. I forgot the first part, which was Trump. People elected Trump democratically. How do we give them a global vision?
Yeah, and also the rise of nationalism.
Nationalism is rising, we need the opposite. When you have an extreme rising, you need to be able to show an alternative, and the global vision doesn't exist right now. So I think we actually need to have a global vision.
You were talking about now removing the veto. How would like that happen? How would you be able to remove the veto from like the main powers?
Sorry, I couldn't hear the beginning. I was talking a lot about.
You're talking about removing the veto power from the super main power, from the super like powers. How would the UN be able to do that? Like,
how could I move the veto power from a few countries to more?
Yes.
So the legal, actual, real answer sucks, but the other one would be better. Is the veto powers have to agree. So to remove the veto powers have to agree that it has to be removed, right? Just like to change any kind of thing in the UN, the veto powers have to agree to it, which is part of the mess. So like this, it will never happen if you consider it this way. The way it could happen is if the UN is messed up enough, if people are angry enough about it, if countries rise up against it enough, and again, 188 countries are second-class countries. A lot of them are extremely angry about it. A lot of them try to work to actually abolish this veto power in the first place. If it's massive enough, if there's enough threats of leaving it, at one point, veto powers will be left with no choice but to change it. But today, like this, not happening. I think there's one just.
Okay, I think we have time for just one other question because we have run over time here. That went quickly. Yes.
So at the end, we talk about there are like two actions we can do, and the first one is to take action to fund transition. So I just want to ask, who and where should we collect the money from, and should government make it indirectly, like indirect tax?
Is it about the climate fund or taxation in general? Sorry.
It's about, yeah, I think it's about the, like, you said about to fund transition, like to cleaner energy, something like that.
Oh, I think you mentioned raising a fund so that less
So-
affluent countries could draw from them so that they could do conversion to cleaner energy.
Yeah.
I think
So-
good question.
So the UN actually has, to give you the less populist and more complete pictures, the UN actually has some funds. It set up some funds on different COPs to finance the transition, mitigate, adapt, and pay for loss and damages. It's close to zero. So last year, at last COP, it's raised, I think, they agreed to pay, what, 330 billions a year in order to help finance the transition. What this means is, rich countries have historically caused climate change. Rich countries have the money to adapt, etc., right? Poorer countries that haven't caused climate change are often at the forefront of it. They are the most vulnerable communities that are paying the price and seeing the impact that rich countries have created. And they lack the resources to be able to adapt. So we need to fund this, also for all of our sake, right? So that we survive. That's a collective good and a justice and a fairness element. We need the money for it. The last COP in Azerbaijan was called the Finance COP. It was supposed to be the moment where we finance the transition. Low-income countries said they needed $1 trillion a year, $1 trillion US dollars a year, in order to be able to do that. It's not just low and middle-income countries. Most scientists and economists working on it, and recommendations from scientific advisory to the UN agreed we needed $1 trillion a year in order to transition. They agreed on 300 billion or something like this. Again, not really there, right? So what you need from this is you need high-income countries to be able to pay up. But not only. You could consider companies that have historically caused this. Again, it's like 100 companies have caused 79% of emissions. You could have a windfall tax on this in order to fill it up. Brazil has also suggested taxing, I think, high net worth individuals at an extremely small percentage. Globally, that's like 100 people, by the way. That's not a lot of people that they would be taxing that would finalize the financing for this fund. So the money is there. It's quite easy to get. The question is whether states are actually willing to pay up. And in theory, they approach this being like, we're going to do a finance up, it's going to be great, we're going to pay up, all of this is going to happen. And then they're like, wait, I have to pay? Maybe not. So that has been the problem. And at the last COP, they've mainly discussed who should pay, whether India, whether China also needed to pay, or whether it was historically emitting countries that needed to pay up. And as a result, looked away from the 1 trillion figure and landed on the 330 billion one.
All right, another round of applause for Cahen-Salvador. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for hanging in there. I know we ran a little over time, but it was great to have all of you here. Thank you. And thank you, Sam.
You like it?
Merci d'être revenu.
Ah, merci beaucoup. Tu parles français?
Oui, je parle français.
J'espère que ça allait.
Oui, oui.